This video is an adaptation of a thread called Polysynthesis for Novices on the ZBB written by Huimems, who kindly permitted me to reproduce it in this form. I have edited and trimmed it, but it remains mostly the same. Let us begin. I've written this introduction to help conlangers figure out how they could design a polysynthetic language, and I've tried to make it interesting and informative for people who are simply interested in linguistics, so be warned that at times it may be pretty dense. For length and simplicity, I've avoided discussing the more recent theoretical work on noun incorporation and non-configurationality, etc. The descriptions here are designed to give an overview and help with conlanger or amateur linguistics. They are not meant to withstand a rigorous investigation of all the details, nor to represent the consensus view of all linguists. Those who are interested should continue to look into such matters on their own. And naturally, I welcome any additional comments, examples, corrections, or questions, etc. from anyone. These are the topics we'll look at. What is polysynthesis? Let's start with the basics. What does it mean to say that a language is polysynthetic? It's a rather vague term and has been used in different ways by different people. Since synthesis refers to the general ratio of morphemes per word in a given language, ultimately all polysynthetic means is that a language has a large number of morphemes per word. In practice, this generally means that the language has verbs that show polypersonal agreement, permits noun incorporation within verbs, makes extensive use of affixes to mark other categories, such as adverbial notions expressed with separate words in less synthetic languages like English, has relatively free word order, and is predominantly head marking. Not all polysynthetic languages have all of these characteristics. Some Eskimo-alien languages, for example, lack noun incorporation under most definitions, but most polysynthetic languages probably have most of them. The upshot is that you can get entire sentences expressed in a single long verb in polysynthetic languages. In fact, this is a common definition for polysynthesis, and one of Evans and Sass's definitions is, polysynthetic languages represent, in a single verbal word, what in English takes an entire multi-word clause. Here's a handful of examples, to help you get the feel for how such languages work, before moving on to a more detailed discussion of each of the aforementioned traits in turn. Note that polysynthetic languages are not evenly distributed geographically. They're extremely common in North America, and fairly common in Central and South America, Siberia, the Caucasus, Northern Australia, and New Guinea. Elsewhere, they are considerably rarer. A quick summary. If you're a real noob to linguistic stuff, in this section I'll summarise the very basic ideas of polysynthetic languages so that you can get started on trying to create your own. But this necessarily means a lot will be oversimplified, so be forewarned. For the most basic beginner's purposes, a polysynthetic language is a language where verb prefix and suffixes, together called affixes, are used to mark a lot of the information that in more familiar languages like English is conveyed with separate words. This usually includes affixes which identify the subject and intransitive verbs the object, any tense, aspect or mood distinctions the language makes, noun roots incorporated into or compounded with the verb to qualify it or identify participants like its former object or intransitive subject, and a host of other notions like directions, adverbial notions, and so on. Polysynthetic languages revolve around their verbs. Most of the work of identifying who was doing what to whom, in what manner, using what instruments, etc. is all accomplished on the verb, and highly inflected verbs, with no other nouns or other words, can often stand as a full, complete sentence. Polypersonal agreement. Polypersonal agreement means that a verb marks multiple core arguments. To oversimplify for a moment, this basically means that both the subject and the object of a clause are marked on the verb. Different languages will distinguish different characteristics that are marked, person, number, gender, and so on, but usually the grammatical role of each participant is made clear in some way, via verbal affixes. Everyone here will already be familiar with a language that marks verbs for at least one core participant. Even English does so marginally, like the s suffix in drinks marks that the subject of the verb is third person singular. Romance languages, which will be familiar to most people watching, provide a somewhat better example, with verbs marking the person and number of their subject by means of suffixes, which also mark tense, aspect, and mood, as in Spanish, hablo, hablas, habla, hablamos, habláis, hablan. Polysynthetic languages then simply extend this type of marking further, and verbs mark both the subject and object. Again, this is oversimplifying, we'll get to complications later. For example, take the baniva of Isana verb rikapani. This breaks down as follows. As you can see, the verb marks the gender, number, and person, and grammatical role of each argument of the verb. Not all polysynthetic languages have separate affixes for subjects and objects, however. In many cases, the morphemes are partly or entirely fused together, such that a single affix marks the person, number, etc. of both subject and object. A good example is the Iroquoian languages. For instance, the Seneca verbal prefix se marks both that the subject is second person and that the object is plural, as in asheoi. For another example, consider the Caravan language Dekwana, where w indicates a first-person subject and third-person object, while y indicates a third-person subject and first-person object. Thus, contrast Wedanta, I met him or her, with Yedanta, she or he meets me. Finally, note that in many cases, polysynthetic languages can mark more than just two participants on the verb. Some other roles that can be indicated include benefactives, indirect objects, and so on, like in the Abkhaz word dbeltart. Noun incorporation. Noun incorporation is ultimately a form of compounding. It combines a noun root or stem with a verb to create a new verb with a more specific meaning. English has some marginal examples, such as berry pick or mountain climb. Here, a noun is combined with a verb to form a new verb with a narrower scope than the original verb, referring now to specific kinds of picking or climbing. However, the English examples aren't very good analogues to the much more productive systems of languages that make heavy use of noun incorporation. For example, in English, verbs with incorporated nouns can usually only appear with further derivation, either as actor or activity deverbals, such as he's a mountain climber, or she went berry picking. Note, before we get onto the various types of noun incorporation, that all forms share several qualities. First, noun incorporation is normally a valence-adjusting phenomenon. In other words, if a verb incorporates what was previously its direct object, the new verb will have its valency reduced by 1, namely from transitive to intransitive, or from ditransitive to transitive. Secondly, incorporated nouns are almost always uninflected, unspecified roots. In most languages, noun roots are never incorporated along with case markers or plurality markers, or noun class markers or articles or demonstratives. I'll give a brief example to illustrate this point from Biningunwok. Note how the noun root, when incorporated into the verb in the second example, no longer has a prefix marking noun class. Very often, as well, the incorporated form of a noun may differ from the form it assumes as a free nominal. This may be a regular process. In Algonquian languages, for instance, the incorporated forms of nouns beginning in M usually lose the M, an irregular process, or even a suppletive process with some nouns, where the incorporated form has no obvious phonological connection to the freestanding noun. Also, note that there's a restriction in all languages on what nouns can be incorporated. As far as I know, no language regularly allows the incorporation of a transitive subject into the verb. Verbs in various languages can incorporate their patient argument, intransitive subject or transitive direct object, or obliques like locations and instrumentals associated with the verb, but agents are never incorporated. Evidently, there are also no known languages in which benefactives or indirect objects, like receivers, can be incorporated. All this is probably a side effect of the use of noun incorporation to background incorporated participants. More on that later. As one final note, be aware that in some languages more than one noun can be incorporated into a single verb. For example, the following Quiba verb has 3 incorporated nouns. Most polysynthetic languages make use of noun incorporation, though the exact systems and their level of productiveness will vary from language to language, and, of course, not all languages with noun incorporation are polysynthetic. Miriam Mithen's work, which I'm drawing on very heavily in this section, distinguishes several types and uses of noun incorporation. The first type is the most basic, noun-verb compounds deriving new verbs, with the incorporated noun root serving to narrow the scope of the original verb root. Compare, for instance, these two Yucatec Maya examples, the first with a separate nominal, and the second with a noun root incorporated into the verb, to narrow the scope of the activity described. More advanced types of noun incorporation, however, can be used for more complex syntactic and discourse effects. The second type is a way of promoting former obliques to subject or direct object status by incorporating the former subject or direct object of the verb. This strategy is used in many languages, like when the underlying subject or direct object does not play a major role in the discourse and the speaker wishes to focus more on the effect the action has on some person or participant who is not an underlying core argument of the verb. For example, English often has body parts as the subjects or direct objects of verbs of feeling. My head hurts. She hit my knee. The second type of noun incorporation allows the underlying subject or direct object to be incorporated into the verb, which means the affected participant can now be cast as the subject or direct object. In English, the examples given, this would be the equivalent of I head hurt or she knee hit me, where I am now the focus of both verbs rather than my head or my knee. All languages which use noun incorporation for this purpose also use it in type 1 situations described before, to narrow the scope of the verb. A real-life example of this sort of thing is the following, again from Yucatec Maya. Note how the object changes from the tree in the first sentence to the cornfield in the second. Here's another real-life example, this time from Blackfoot. The third use of noun incorporation takes place on the level of the discourse, rather than an individual clause or sentence. This use of noun incorporation backgrounds established nouns. In languages with type 3 noun incorporation, a noun is generally introduced into the discourse with the separate nominal, but further mentions of it, now that it's established material, are often incorporated into the verb, unless the noun is highly focused. All languages which use type 3 noun incorporation also use types 1 and 2. As an example of type 3, consider the following Koryak text. When the whale is first mentioned, it is referred to with a separate noun. After that, it is incorporated into the verb as established information. The final type of noun incorporation is the incorporation of semantically broad noun roots in order to classify or specify the verb action. The verb can then, in addition, still take overt nominals marking subject and object. This is essentially the use of noun incorporation as a classificatory system. In fact, in many cases, a participant is first introduced with both an overt nominal and classificatory incorporation on the verb, and then for future reference to the participant, all that is needed is to make use of the incorporated classifying nominal. A long but useful example is the following excerpt from a Mohawk story. Note that the bullheads are first introduced with a separate nominal, rabahbo, but also with a classifying incorporated nominal in the verb itsi, meaning fish. The story continues, telling of how the speaker's uncle found and caught the fish, and then in all these subsequent sentences, the bullheads are referred to only through the incorporated noun root its, functioning as something of a classifier. Mithun reports that languages with productive use of type 4 noun incorporation will have all of types 1, 2, and 3 as well. Mithun's paper was written a number of years ago, and I understand there have been a number of refinements or alternative theoretical approaches proposed by various researchers since then, but the basic rubric is probably close enough to the truth that it can be extremely useful to conlangers. Other affixes. So to summarise what we've covered so far, polysynthetic languages are basically languages in which verbs are frequently very long, consisting of a number of morphemes, and which often are the equivalent of entire English sentences. In part, this is explained by the ability of polysynthetic languages to mark the person, number, gender, or whatever of both the subject and object on the verb, and by the ability of many polysynthetic languages to incorporate into the verb a noun root or noun roots to serve various semantic and discourse functions. But these factors alone don't fully explain the length of verbs in many polysynthetic languages. Most, perhaps all, polysynthetic languages also use verbal affixes to mark other notions that in languages like English are expressed with separate words. These often include a tremendous range of notions: adverbial ideas, temporal ideas, verbal or complementing ideas, locational and directional ideas, instrumental ideas, and many others. Here I will give a few more examples with some discussion to help demonstrate the range of possible notions which can be expressed. This is not meant to be exhaustive, and note that polysynthetic languages also generally use verb morphology to accomplish a range of valency adjusting operations like causation and passivization, as well as much of the tense, aspect, and mood information of the clause, but since these are more familiar categories, I won't address them here. Ojibwe is an Algonquian language of the Great Lakes region, and also the polysynthetic language I know best. For our purposes, I'm only going to focus on a handful of the concepts that can be expressed in Ojibwe via verb morphology, in addition to polypersonal marking and noun incorporation, both of which Ojibwe has. For one thing, the Ojibwe verb suffixes, which serve to mark transitivity and the animacy of the absolutive participant, often carry fairly concrete semantic notions as well, expressing things like environmental descriptions or action, instrumentals, orientation, motion or movement, and so on. Like other Algonquian languages, Ojibwe also has several classificatory verb affixes, which specify the shape and consistency, etc., of a participant, normally an absolute or oblique. These include the following, and some examples are as follows. Evidentiality is the marking of the source of the speaker's information, and several polysynthetic languages make use of sophisticated morphologically marked evidential systems, though a number of languages with evidentiality are far from polysynthetic. For example, Tariana distinguishes 5 evidentials marked with suffixes that also mark tense: visual, non-visual, inferred, assumed, and reported, and examples illustrating all 5 evidentials in the recent past tense are as follows. Like other Eskimo-Aleut languages, Central Alaskan Yupik has hundreds of derivational suffixes, called postbases, which can be added to noun or verb roots to create new stems. Note that in many cases, constructions like this are very similar to noun incorporation or other compounding. The main difference is that these suffixes do not represent free verbs. That is, they are bound suffixes and cannot be used without attaching to a host root. I'll go through these examples quickly, so pause if you need to. Some postbases attach to nominal roots and create new nouns. Some postbases attach to verb roots but create new nouns. Some postbases attach to verb roots and create new verbs. And finally, some postbases attach to nominal roots but create new verbs. These are the cases that strongly resemble noun incorporation. Many languages of the northwest coast of North America have hundreds of suffixes, called lexical suffixes, which are bound, like the Yupik derivational suffixes we've just seen, but which otherwise carry extremely concrete lexical meanings. Aside from their bound nature and the fact that they normally have no obvious etymological connection to corresponding free nouns, the lexical suffixes with nominal meanings are indistinguishable from noun roots. Likewise, aside from their bound nature and the fact that they normally have no obvious etymological connection to corresponding free verbs, the lexical suffixes with verbal meanings are indistinguishable from verb roots. The same can be said of lexical suffixes with locational, directional, adverbial, etc. meanings. Here is a sample of just a few of the 400-odd lexical suffixes of Nuu-Chah-Nulth, a Wakashan language of British Columbia, and, as before, I'll be going through these quickly, so you might want to pause the video. Some of the suffixes are very verbal in meaning, and in fact the resulting stem is a verb. Others are more nominal in meaning, and the resulting stem is a noun. One of the most notable usage of lexical suffixes, though, is in conveying extremely precise indications of location, space, orientation, direction, and movement. Many of these are body part terms. This final example is a single word which illustrates just how much information can be packed into a single verb in this way. Or take the following example sentence as well for a second example. Coasati is a Muskogean language of Texas and Louisiana, with one of the most elaborate verbal systems I've ever seen. The verbal template can be represented as follows, with 9 prefix slots and 15 suffix slots. What follows are merely some examples. For the prefixes, slot 9 marks the object of the verb as being indefinite. Slot 8 marks the directionality of the verb, either coming or going. Slot 7 is instrumental, either just a plain with, or at a distance, or containing something. Slot 6 is distributive or iterative. Slot 3 is for specific locatives, of which there are 9. On the ground or in a fire, in water, raised up, on a vertical plane, in the middle of or in twain, on a face, on a mouth, or on a throat. Well, the suffix is, slot 1 is for adverbs like very, almost, really, in the same way, all the time, must, etc. Slot 4 marks an intended action. Slot 5 marks ability to do something. Slot 7 is deductive. Slot 8 marks other modalities like almost and hypotheticals. Slot 9 marks doubt about what the speaker is saying. Slot 10 marks that the speaker's information is second-hand or was said by another person. Slot 11 marks the speaker's information as coming from a sound. And slot 13 marks consequences of 5 kinds. First are potential or unreal consequences. Second are generalized possibilities. third marks the reason for something, fourth marks contrast like the English word but, and the fifth marks but as well, but in scenarios where what occurs is contrary to expectation. That's the end of part 1, and in part 2 we'll be looking at free word order, how polysynthesis arises, and where to go from there. I thank my patrons, and as always, don't like and don't subscribe.